Welcome to my next course about Gimp. In this one we're going to explore the basics of this program, especially from the perspective of a photographer. To be perfectly honest, I'm not this great photographer, but I've got a couple of years of experience editing photos and using Gimp. So what I'm teaching here is more from the perspective of a Gimp user than from the perspective of a photographer. A couple of things to add before we start. We want to use the latest version. You can check that under Help and About. For me it's 2.10.36 and you can check for updates right here in this box. Obviously when you watch this video at some point in the future it's going to be a different version, but for the most part it should look like the layout that you see here, which is the default layout. You can download it on gimp.org. I'm going to link to it in the video description. Good idea to only use this download link from the official source so that you don't get some nasty stuff onto your computer. Once that is done and it's installed, go to Edit Preferences. I want to make sure that we use the same layout and the same language. You can check that right here under Interface. You also want to open this drop down, but under Interface directly is the language. We'll use English for US. Confirm we are OK. And we'll use under Window Management the default values for these window positions, which is the default layout. If yours doesn't look like mine, just click on this button right here for reset and confirm we are OK. Afterwards you have to close Gimp and then start it again. So Interface for the language, and open a drop down Window Management for the layout, close it, restart it, and then everything should look like this. And that's our starting point for our tutorial. One more thing to add, if you're totally new to using Gimp, I've made a specific video right here, full Gimp beginner course, which deals more with graphic design, but also the basics. So this would be a better course for you to try. And I also have a specific selection course about Gimp. I go over all of the details for beginners here a little bit more slowly and explain it more in detail. So you may want to check out these two courses. And if there are specific questions about Gimp, I have a dedicated playlist and a photography Gimp tutorials for beginner. Just open it. It currently has almost 300 videos where I've made shorter videos, and you can also find these two courses yet again. So for specific questions, check out that playlist. But if you're a photographer and you know at least a little bit about Gimp, the course that you see right here should be the one for you. One more thing to add, we're going to use photos that you can download and then use yourself directly in the projects that I'm going to introduce in every chapter. We'll use a free resource called Unsplash. Just be careful, here are some photos with a plus sign. You have to pay for them, but those that don't have this icon are free to use, even in commercial projects. And in every chapter where I will use one of these, I'm going to link to them. So you'll find links to the resource used in the video description as well. And obviously a link to this website. Before we can actually use Gimp, we need to import some files. And most stuff that you encounter as a photographer, Gimp is able to process. What you usually have is a JPEG or a PNG. In principle, Gimp also swallows PDFs and a couple of files that you don't really encounter, so there are a couple of options. We have a couple of ways to import them. Number one is to simply drag and drop them here onto the canvas. When you've started Gimp, you might get this warning message for conversion when it comes to RGB colors. Usually you just want that, so confirm it. And here would be a simple JPEG. You can also go to File and then Open, find the file. I use the same, this JPEG that we have opened. I double click on it and you can see it is open in a new project. So we have this 2 times now here. If you have an already open project and you pick, for example, this PNG, which Gimp can also process, and you drag and drop it, it will be opened, but it will be open in the same project. You can see that now we have our JPEG and the PNG on top, and here's the project where we only have the JPEG. If you want the new file to be opened in a new project, you'll have to use File and Open. Let's do that for the PNG. Double click, and now we have it here as a new project. PNGs usually have transparency inbuilt, so in this case it's a water drop or a water stream, something like this. So if I add a background here, I make it transparent and now white, you can see it shines through. And JPEGs don't have transparency, just for explanation for those that haven't heard it. And as I've said, these are the two usual formats that you use, especially JPEGs when it comes to photography. When you have multiple files that you want to have open in the same project, you can also select both and then drag and drop them automatically at the same time. A third common file type that you use as a photographer is the RAW file type. Technically, Gimp can load this, but not directly. So if you've just installed it, it shouldn't be able to do. Here we have a RAW file. I'll drag and drop it. And then you should get a warning message like this, so that the loading has failed, as there is no RAW loader installed. This should be the default when you've opened it. There are a couple of options, for example, Darktable and RAW Therapy. It's up to you what you use. Let us check under Edit Preferences and then the Image Import Export. You can scroll down and there's this drop down for Plugin RAW Image Importer. And by default, you should only have this placeholder. So placeholder.exe installed. If you have something else here, you don't need to install Darktable. Maybe you've already gotten Darktable installed. In that case, importing RAW files should directly work. But in our case, I'll guide you through the installation. As I've said, Darktable open source, so it's free to use. I'm going to link to it in the video description below. Just click on install and then pick your system, in my case Windows. You have to download it. Once that has been done, start the installer exe. If you just confirm everything, it should automatically be installed in the backend or connected to Gimp. One thing to mention though is when you start it the first time, it might change your system language. In my case, as I'm German, I've used a German browser, my German browser setting, and therefore Darktable was installed in German, and this resets Gimp to that language. So you may have to go to Edit Preferences, Interface, and then set the language again to English. That's the language that we want to use in our tutorial. Then close. Load it again. And now you can see it's English, and in our image import export in this drop down, we can now see Darktable. So let me make this a little bit bigger. Here's the placeholder and above is Darktable. So now we can use our RAW file, drag and drop it here, and then Darktable should start automatically. Here it is. As I've said, in my case, it's now German. I don't want to make this tutorial about Darktable. I just wanted to show you how you could open RAW files in Gimp. You can play around here, adjust it, whatever you want to do. So let me just close this window. Gimp should automatically import this file. It might take a couple of seconds. But there you go. At the bottom was the process, and here you get a message. Once again, in my case, for these colors, I converted. And here's now this RAW file. So as you've seen, you only have to install Darktable, and then everything works automatically. So if you want to work or have to work with RAW files, I would advise you to use Darktable. As you've seen, it's pretty easy to install and pretty easy to use. After importing the image, cropping might be one of the first things that you want to do. And you can do that in this toolbox right here. You will find the crop tool. Shift-C would be the short key. If you don't find it, you can still go to Tools, Transform Tools, and there you should definitely find it. All of the tools in the toolbox are categorized here in this little drop-down. When you left click on it, you will see the tool options popping up right here. So the specific options for this tool, in our case to crop. And when you now left click drag on your canvas, on your photo, you can see this highlighted region. And in my case, I've got it fixed to 16:9. Let me uncheck this box. And now I can freely transform this cropping highlighted window. When you press enter, this would be confirmed, but let us go over all of the options here. You can use numerical values for the size. Let me make that 2000 times 1500. You can adjust the position numerically. Here's a drop down if you want to switch, for example, to millimeters or inches. It not only gets confirmed when you press enter, but also when you have it highlighted and then you switch to a different tool. Whenever something like this happens and you don't want it, just press Ctrl Z, which is the undo. So we're back to original. I use the cropping again, left click drag, it's freely transformable. So I can go to the edges and left click drag, transform it further. If I go to center, left click drag, I reposition it. There are a couple of lines on this highlighted box. I like to use the rule of thirds, but you can change that to center lines, rule of fifths, go to ratio, whatever you need. Just use this drop down. You can even use no guides if you don't want that at all. First checkbox right here is for current layer only, so if you have more than one layer right here in the layers menu, it would all be cropped. For the most part, you don't want that, especially when you work with photos. You want to crop them one by one or adjust them one by one. But if you uncheck the box, all of the layers would be affected. Second option is for the delete pixels. I think delete to crop pixels is obvious, but allow growing might be worth exploring. Let us check it. And now I can resize my crop window beyond the canvas size. And this is not possible when I uncheck this. You can see I left click and it jumps directly back into the canvas size. Expand from center. By default, when you create a new window, left click drag, it starts where you drag it and then expands to top, bottom, left or right. But if you have expand from center, you left click drag and this will always be the center point of your highlighted region. So the cropping, I don't like to have that. I usually uncheck it. So now we have it expanding in both dimensions. Here we have the fixed option. I've already introduced that a little bit. You can use different ways to fix it. I like to use the aspect ratio, but you can use width, height. I've set it to 16:9. You can flip it to, for example, make a TikTok thumbnail, something like this. It should be 9:16. And now your box will always have this aspect ratio no matter how you try to resize that. And if you uncheck it, you can freely transform it. Finally, we have this highlight option. This can be adjusted via the slider. And it simply makes everything outside of the box more visible or less visible, depending on where you put the slider. Let me press Ctrl Z again. And now let's assume we want to work on that. It's certainly a good photo, but we may want to crop it a little bit on top and bottom. So let me use the crop tool. And I want to freely transform it, so I uncheck the box, hover over the edges, left click drag to adjust the box a little bit, at the bottom especially. And now I press enter. What you can see is that the cropping has worked. We also have this weird checkerboard design. In Gimp, this is always an indicator for transparency. But if we would now export this, for example, as a PNG, we would also get these transparent areas. So in this case, rectangles. Therefore, it makes sense to crop the canvas according to our image. There is a simple function for that inbuilt in Gimp. And you can find that under image. It's called crop to content. If you left click on it, the canvas will be adjusted to the content that's visible. So in our case, our cropped image. And now if we export it, we will not have these transparent areas. Therefore, I would say that image crop to content is an important feature to know and to memorize. You will have to use that a lot. If you now import the original, you can see the size difference. What I like to use though is the original. Let me open that in a new project, and then I like to copy it. I'll keep the original, I call it original size, as a backup, and then I'll work on the copy. So let me crop that again. Left click drag. This time I'll make it fixed, 16 by 9. Drag it a little bit down. I press enter to confirm. You can see original is still in the background. And now I go to image, crop to content. And that's the way I would do it. So in case anything happens, I will always have the original as a backup. And I would recommend that you do it the same way. For you to practice, pick an image, maybe the same that I've used here, you find it in the video description, then crop it a little bit, go over all of the functions that I've shown you, and once you've cropped it to your liking, use image crop to content, and then you're ready for the next chapter. You may have already seen this, but for those who haven't, most of these editing softwares use a layer structure. I've talked about this in my Gimp beginner course, so I'm only going to go quickly over this here. What that means is we will stack elements on top of one another here, and we can copy, for example, our original. That's this original copy. It's a second layer. I call that black and white. And then we make this a bit bigger. You can always left click drag and make these menus expand. Now I go to colors and desaturate, and I confirm. On the canvas it looks like we now have a black and white image, but this only applies to the top layer as we have selected this before adding the desaturate effect. And if we put this below the original, we have our colored now on top, and therefore the colored one is visible. We can put the color one below the black and white, and the black and white is visible again. Same goes for all elements. In Gimp, for example, a text element. Let me quickly create one. It gets its own layer. If I put it below the black and white, we can't see it. It needs to be on top. Let me delete this text layer. One thing to keep in mind is when you now select a portion here, and you are on the top layer, which is black and white, and you want to have a rectangle, use, for example, the Bokeh Effect tool, left click on it with a black color. We don't have a rectangle. And the reason why is the selection has selected a portion of our black and white layer. So if you wanted to have an actual black rectangle, and press Ctrl Z, you would need to create a new layer and call that rectangle. I'll make it transparent and confirm you're OK. It's on top and selected, and now I left click using the Bokeh Effect tool, and we've got this black rectangle. Shift Ctrl A to deselect, by the way, is one of the short keys that you should memorize. The same applies here. I can move it in the layers order below the other ones, and then it becomes invisible. There's also this eye icon. This makes stuff invisible when you left click on it, and you can bring them back by left clicking on it yet again. In conjunction with layers, masks are another concept to understand. Let us go to the top one, our rectangle layer, then right click, add layer mask. There are a couple of options for us. Full opacity white and full transparency black are the interesting ones, at least for now. If we go to white, full opacity, and add, nothing is visible, so nothing has changed on the canvas, but in the layers menu we now have our rectangle layer and this white element next to it, and this is the layer mask. Let us, for example, add a black layer mask to the black and white, which is full transparency. And now we have this black element next to our black and white layer element. And you can also see on the canvas, we can now see the colored one. So the color one blends through because the black layer mask of the black and white layer makes this layer invisible. So whenever you use layer masks, black and white are not really the colors black and white. They just stand for opacity and transparency. You could also say white reveals and black conceals. That's an easy saying to remember. We could also delete layer masks, right click, and it's gone. Let us use the paintbrush. We'll make this white as a foreground color and I make it a bit bigger. I'm on the rectangle layer and not the layer mask, and this is why I can paint in white over it. But if I switch from the layer to the layer mask, which is white, right here, and then I paint, nothing is visible, as I've just painted with white on a white layer mask. If I make this black now, I switch back to the layer, I paint over it, you can see the black color, press Ctrl Z, I go to the layer mask, black color, I paint over it, and now you don't see the black stripe or the black color that I've painted. Instead, it has made the rectangle partially transparent, and this is what I mean by using black and white. These are not colors anymore in the layer mask, they just stand for opacity and transparency. So I can bring back this rectangle with a white color as long as I paint on the layer mask, and I can make it invisible with a black color. Lots of effects will use these principles, so we are going to go over this a couple of times. But to directly show you an effect, we'll add a white layer mask to our black and white photo right here. I'm on the layer mask and then I use a black color and paint over it. And this makes it transparent in these areas and therefore blends through the colored photo below, the original. And this is what is called a color splash effect, where everything is black and white except for one element. Most prominent example is the movie Sin City, where this is used. I zoom in holding Ctrl and then I use the mouse wheel and I move around pressing the space bar. And then I go over this with the black color. Whenever I paint too far over the edges, I switch the colors using the short key X. White is then the foreground color. And with white I can make these colors disappear again as it brings back the black and white elements. And here's our final result. With these effects, it's always that the more time you put in, the better results will look. But I think this is a decent one for a 2-3 minute work. Try to understand these principles. Best way to do that is to practice. You can find the link to the same photo in the video description. Maybe you want to use the same, create a color splash. In any case, we will use this principle time and time again, so make sure to at least get a little bit of practice on your hands. Once you've understood the principle of this layer structure, we can use that to our advantage and easily edit photos by using the blending modes. So let me copy the original here, and then you can open this drop down. It starts with normal. Unfortunately, my screen recorder doesn't reach that far, but you can see right here, top option, normal. Now it says it here. And once I've got it selected, I can use the arrow keys up and down to cycle through all of these options. For now, nothing really happens. Here, erase gets rid of it. And once we've arrived at screen, we can see an effect happening. And let's go further. And you can see if I make this invisible, it has changed the original a lot. And then let's go to darken, and I'll use the arrow keys again. An easy way to intensify your photos is to go to multiply right here. So we've got the original just copied, and then blend the copy with the original by using multiply. And now you can use the opacity slider down here. 0 makes it invisible, so there is no difference between the original and what we can see here. But if I increase the opacity, this multiply blend is added more and more. And at around 60%, we have definitely improved this image. It's a little bit overexposed. And you can always copy this layer and add different blending modes to blend them all together. For example, here a linear burn. I don't want to go too high as it would make it too dark. It's about the principle and how easy it is to improve photos. You don't have to use any of these complex tools. Just try out the blending modes, the opacity, and then rely on your eye. Pick what you like. And it's very intuitive, as you can see what is happening in real time as you adjust it. Be aware that some blending modes, for example here the white, they create more abstract results. In photography, we don't really need that. I don't want to go over all of these blending modes and how they work. The ones that I always use, I don't forget, but the rest I have to look that up from time to time what they do. To show the principle behind the ones that I always use and know, and I'm pretty sure that you know after using them a couple of times. Let us create a new layer. I make it half black and half white. It's on top of the original. And now we'll use blending modes for this one. So for our black-white rectangle. And overlay, screen and multiply are the ones that I always use first and check. And here for multiply you can see it blends the white colors fully. And for screen it blends the black colors fully. They are kind of like opposites, you could say. And Dodge, for example, I had to look it now up what it does. But screen, multiply, overlay, these are the three ones. Always to try first and to check. And over time you get a feel for it, and the rest just cycle through that using the arrow keys as I've shown you. And if something meets the eye that you like, just keep it. For this example, I would copy the original, use multiply for the copy, and then adjust it using opacity, and then I would already be happy. But in principle I could copy this a couple of times and then play around with it. But there you go. I want you to do the same. Pick a photo, something that you found for example on Unsplash, and then try these blending modes. Also add a little bit of opacity by using the slider above, and then try to improve the photo like that. So no complex tools, no advanced techniques, just blending. Scaling works pretty easy in Gimp. Once again, I like to copy the original to have a backup. We are on the copy and here's the scale tool. You can right click on this box and then select it. This is the transform toolbox. Shift S is the short key. And if you can't find it or you have trouble finding it, you can also go to Tools, in the top menu, find the Transform tools, and there is the scaling tool. Left click on it, it's active then, and you see these options. If you can't see them, there's the Tool Options box or Tool Options menu. You can go to Windows Dockable Dialogs, and there it is. I left click on it, it gets highlighted as it's already active. But if it isn't and you click on it right here, it should open up. Don't let it confuse you too much, it's relatively easy. We don't need most of these options, we can keep the defaults. But to quickly go over this, we can keep the aspect ratio for example, so this makes width and height connected, and this is usually what you want for images anyway, because everything else it skews with the image. So let me uncheck this box and now it's freely transformable, and now we have a different format. It's going to change the proportions, and for photos, images, we don't want that usually. You can also transform it from the center. So if you want to keep the center point and just make it bigger or smaller, check this box. Then there are guides that you can use. For example, rule of thirds. It just helps a little bit for finding good positions. And you can adjust the image opacity here for this transformable box. On top, you can adjust what you want to transform Usually it's the layer, but you could also transform an image, a path, or a selection. And the direction, you want to keep that. And for the interpolation, there are different options. So this is basically the process that happens in the background, which scales it up. I would advise you to just keep it to linear. I've never used a different interpolation method myself. Doesn't mean that the other ones are bad. If you're not happy with linear, just try out the other ones and then just pick what you like best. But as I've said, linear usually produces good results that you can definitely use. If you can't see all of these adjustment options, simply left click on your photo and then you should see them. You can drag any of these points and scale it from that position on. And the center is for repositioning. Just left click drag. On the top right on your canvas, you can also see a couple of options. Here are width and height numerically. So if you have a specific number in mind, just type that in and it's going to get scaled. Aspect ratio is kept when this link icon is active next to the numbers. And we have 3 options for reset, readjust, and scale. Scale confirms it. So now it's scaled up. Reset would bring it back to the original. And readjust is for the scale box, so the scaling window. In this case, let me reposition it using the move tool. And now if we compare it, we've got it scaled up. It's very simple to do and you can see it right away as you do it. So I think the principle is very clear. One problem though, if you want to scale this now again, so I activate the tool, left click on it, and then I want to reset it to its original, that won't work. So the reset doesn't store the original size, it stores what it is when you activate the scale tool. So in this case I can't just reset this already scaled up one to the original and readjust it for this box as I've said. And that's one of the reasons why I like to use a copy, so now I would have the original to work with. But if you don't do that and you want to go back to the original, you can use the undo history. Just go to Windows, Dockable Dialogs, Undo History. It should be right here, left click on it. And here are all of the actions that you've performed, so that I just performed here in this tutorial. And you can go back one step at a time and check, right here was the original size. So if you need that back, we will start here again, and this will undo all of the stuff that happened afterwards. So what you've learned from this chapter is the scale tool itself, the 2 options for it, and the undo history. Make sure to try that out, pick an image that you like, and just transform it a little bit, scale it up, scale it down, and see how that works. Flipping an image is super easy, as there is a specific flip tool right here. Shift F is the short key. You can also find it under Tools. You've got the usual options here for transform. Just keep the first one as we only want to flip this layer. And you can switch between vertical and horizontal here. Left click on it to make it flip. There's also a rotate tool. Shift R is the short key for it. It has a couple of more options, but most of these are just for the appearance. When you left click on it, this menu on the top right is more important. Here you can set the angle via the slider numerically. Or you can just reset it and left click on this image and then drag to make it rotate. You can also adjust the center, which is the rotation center. Let me, for example, put it right here on the left middle, and now it rotates around that point. You can use these predefined points here or even add via numerical values a specific one. And once you've got the position that you want, confirm via rotate. Usually rotation leads to you having transparent spots. So if I make the original invisible, you can see that here. So after using rotate, in most cases you want to use the scale tool right here. Just drag these points far enough so that your image exceeds the transparent spots on each corner. Let me check. And there's still one missing here at the top and at the bottom a little bit. I'll make this a bit bigger. I confirm via scale. And here was the original. Easy to use tools, very intuitive I think, but still, if this is the first time that you've heard about these tools, make sure that you use them rotate an image, flip it, and then come back for the next chapter. Sometimes the horizon in your photos isn't straightened out perfectly. We can fix that in post using Gimp relatively easily. What we need is the measure tool. You cannot find it right here under these drop downs for tools, but it's below Shift M as the short key. It should be here. And once that is active, just set the orientation. Auto should be fine. And interpolation cubic is once again a way to calculate the adjustments. Keep it to cubic and then check if you're happy with it. And for the most part, it has never happened that I wasn't happy with it, but you could use different interpolation methods here. What makes a huge difference though is the clipping. I've got it set to clip to results and we'll keep it like that at least for now. Then I left click drag and I straighten the line. So this is a new orientation line. You can zoom in holding control using the mouse wheel and reposition these points. And this will be the new straight horizontal line when you click on straighten now. And you can see that we need to scale it up afterwards, and we press Ctrl Z, and now I use adjust, and I do it again. And now it has just cropped it differently. So this is what this clipping dropdown does. I usually use crop to results. Let me do it again. Straighten. And now I use the scale tool, Shift S, left click on it, scale it a little bit up. But I've overdone it a little bit. But you can see it works. This straightens the perspective. But let me do that again here. I went too far. This would be a better line, I would assume. Let me confirm we are straight yet again, scale it up once more. And there you go. This is how you can straighten the horizon in Gimp. As I said, try cubic, auto, and crop to result, and then just scale it up. Next up, I'll show you how you can quickly add a border or a frame to a photo. We'll put it on a new layer. We'll make it have the name frame, and just make sure that it's filled with transparency. So on top of the photo, I use the rectangle select tool. Left click drag. You don't have to be perfect here, as you can see. As long as you exceed this canvas, it's going to select the entire canvas. These are the default settings, so we're good. Now we go to select and shrink it. Let me try 20. I confirm we're okay. And you can see a small border now. But let me press Ctrl Z. I go again to select shrink and I try 50 to make it a bit bigger. It depends on the image size that you've got, how big it should be, but 50 should be good for our example here. And by the way, there is a selection editor inbuilt in Gimp. This shows you exactly what you've got selected and what not. You will find it under Windows, Dockable Dialogs. It's right here, Selection Editor, left click on it, and then it pops up here. The white stuff is what is selected, the black is what is not. And we want to invert this now. So we go to select, invert, and now you can see we've got the black parts which are not selected, and a white frame, a white border. Now all we have to do is to use the paint bucket tool, as long as we're on our frame layer here. I make it white, left click on it, and we've got a white frame. You can change the color, so use for example red, confirm, and left click again with the paint bucket tool. I want to keep it white, so I press Ctrl Z. Last step, select none, and you're good. You've got your frame on a different layer, and you can add this in the same way to any photo. Try to do that yourself. It's fairly easy as you've seen, and then come back for the next chapter. Removing objects from photos is fairly easy in Gimp. We'll copy the original, and then we have in principle, two basic options, which is the clone and the healing tool. Healing tries to blend it with the original, while the clone doesn't, but both tools work the same way. To use it, you hover over an area where there is something that you don't want to replace, and then you hold Ctrl or left click. This is now your reference point, and it's indicated by this dashed line, and then you left click drag over the areas that you want to replace. Here's the heating tool, and you can see it tries to blend this sand now with the original colors of the ocean. But if I use a clone tool, I'll set the reference point on the sand again, holding Control and left click. You can see it doesn't blend. So this is the big difference. The way I would use them, let me copy the original again. I like to use the clone tool first. By the way, you can adjust size and all of these brush settings down here. Then for this boat to disappear, I place my reference point on the ocean. So I'll Control and left click. Then I go over this ship. Ship is gone, but it doesn't blend well with the environment. So now I use the clone tool and I go over it again. Set my reference point on the ocean, left click drag. And now we've got a nice transition, and it looks like nothing was there to begin with. Let us do it again. So clone tool first, set my reference point, holding Control left click. I go over the boat. This is basically the rough erase. You can see it doesn't blend that well. So now we use the heating tool, another reference point, left click drag. I go over this area again, and this adds a nice blend. And if you wouldn't know that there were two boats, you would notice that something is missing. Let's go over this once again, and I'll show you one more thing to take care of or to be careful with. We'll start with the clone tool, and I set my reference point maybe right here on the ocean. But it's a little bit close to the boat, so if I left click drag, it now gives me this white yellowish boat again. So be careful where you put your reference points. You don't want to paint over something like a second boat in this case. Same goes for the healing tool. So if you put the reference point too close to the second boat right here, you can see parts of it are now repainted, and that's surely nothing that we want. So always put the reference point where you've got enough space to work with. But when you keep that in mind, these tools are fairly easy to use. Try it out yourself. Just search for an image, for example beach, and there you've got lots to replace. As I said, use the clone tool first, then the healing tool, and then you should be good. I'm not a huge fan of watermarks, but many photographers want to add them to their photos. You can easily import a logo, then move it, I don't know, let's say to the bottom right, scale it a little bit down. In my case we have a PNG, so we can directly use the opacity slider, go to around 40 to 50%. And that's usually the way you can create a watermark. Let's just say you have a logo that's not a PNG with a transparent background, but that has, for example, a white background. You just have to use a different blending mode. Multiply should work. And then go down with the opacity yet again. Move it around, scale it a little bit down if you have to. But that's the only adjustment. If you have a white logo on a black background, try out screen as a blending mode. And for a black background on a white background, you've seen multiply works. You can also just create a text element. So maybe you have your own photography business, let's say brick photography. I'll just type this in here quickly. It's black. I'll put it to the top right. Yet again, go down with the opacity to around 40 to 50%. And this is how you can add these watermarks. Very easy to do. Try it out yourself and then come back for the next chapter. There's an option to remove and even to add noise to photos. Here we don't have much, but a little bit. In the original, let me copy this. And we can try to remove it using filters, enhance and noise reduction. Simple one slider option. Just make sure to check the preview and you can see the effect applied in real time. What this basically does is it blurs the noise that's in there, so it's going to get a little bit blurry. You can see that right here in the image. So you will lose a couple of details, but in exchange for that you get rid of some of the noise. This effect becomes even clearer when I add very intense noise. So let me copy the originate again. I call this added noise. I go to filters, noise. There are a couple of options. HSV noise is usually what you want to use. It's for hue, saturation and the value, which is the intensity here. But we'll get back to this menu later on. I'll show you a different one, which is RGB, so red, green and blue noise. There's some weirder ones like slur, which I would say skews a little bit with the perspective. But as I've said, HSV is the typical noise that you get. Let me increase these values and I zoom in. And here you can see clearly now the values for the intensity. Dulling and the random seed are for randomization. You can click on new seed and then create a completely different random result. Let us just confirm this one. We've added our noise. Let us compare to the original and you can see that. Depending on the zoom level, it's not that obvious, but here you can clearly see it, especially when the contrast is high here on this, this street limiter. Let us copy this added noise result, so this is the one with the noise, and I call this noise remover as I now want to use under enhance the noise reduction. And now it becomes, I think, fairly obvious what this does. It blurs the noise and blends it with the background, therefore it looks like it's gone, but you're going to lose a couple of details. That's the downside of it. But for a simple freely available one-click option, it's not a bad result. As noise can be a problem, sometimes even a huge problem in photography, try it out yourself. As you've seen, it's very easy to do. Adding noise might be primarily a design effect, but in some instances it makes sense to even add that to photos, so try it out yourself. As I've said, HSV noise is the filter of choice, but try the other ones out as well. There are many ways to create vignettes in Gimp. The easiest way is to use a filter. Let us just copy the original here. We'll go to filters under light and shadow. You should find it. It's called vignette. Menu looks a little bit complex, but to be honest, it's rather easy if you just left click drag on the canvas itself. So you can, for example, adjust the squeeze, position, softness, gamma, all of this stuff by just using these anchor points, these white circles on the vignette that have popped up here. And then you can see the effect applied in real time. So I think it's way easier to just use the canvas instead of the menu. Because sometimes here, for example, radius and squeeze are adjusted at the same time to squeeze it a little bit in the horizontal axis, and it's way more intuitive to do that directly on the canvas. Once you've got what you want, when it comes to position, it's a good idea to open the blending options in the menu and then play a little bit around with the opacity, because normally you don't want to have such a harsh vignette. Something like this would be better. And you can also adjust the colors. If you want to have a white vignette or any other color, you can fix that here. Don't forget to confirm. And here's a before and after. Make sure to practice that. Let me delete this one. And I copied 2 times. I want you to create a white and a black vignette using this filter. So let me rename that to black and white. Pick values that fit your image that you like. But it's always a good idea to have a good feather, so that the transition between the non-colored parts, so here the center, and this vignette isn't that harsh. So you want to play around with this dashed line in the middle. As I've said in the introduction, there are many ways to create vignettes. Let me show you a second way. I will use this image right here. But instead of making this just a black or white vignette, we'll create a blur vignette. It's an interesting effect, especially for product photography. You can see in the top right, I've got the selection editor open. You will find that under select, just left click on it and then it pops up. And if I now use an ellipse on a copy of my photo, we can select this car, which is then indicated by the white ellipse in the selection editor. But I want to feather this out. Let me add a feather of 100. And it's a good idea to add that 2 times. So let me feather this once more using 100. And now we have a good transition between what we want to have sharp and what should be blurred. We want to blur the outside. Therefore, we have to invert our selection first. Because right now the car is selected and we want to blur everything but the car. To invert our selection, we go to Select, Invert. Now we right click on our layer, add layer mask, use Selection, Confirm. Go back to the photo, the layer itself, not the mask. And then go to Filters, Blur, use a Gaussian blur for example. And if I make this extreme, you can see everything's blurred but the car. I don't want to make it too extreme, but a value of 20 should be fine. And this would be another method to create vignettes. In this case, I've created a very strong vignette, but you can see this also works. Try to practice. As I've said, use the filters, light and shadow vignette option, and also use this manual to create a vignette. There's an inbuilt histogram in Gimp. Let me copy the original, and you can find it, for example, under colors, info. If you left click on it, it's going to open the menu. If for some reason you don't find it there, go to Windows, Dockable Dialogs, and right here you can find it as well. Left click on it. It's a typical histogram that you know from your camera. You can switch to RGB channels. Most you want to stick to value. And you want to keep the defaults. You can, for example, change this from linear to logarithmic. But if you're a total beginner, I would just advise you to keep the defaults, linear view. And let us go over the basics. It goes from 0 to 255, so we've got our 256 colors again. On the left you will find the, in simple terms, darkest spots, and on the right the lightest. Let me open the exposure option. And if I adjust the exposure, you can see how this moves our little graph here to the right. If I add to the exposure, and if I subtract, it's going to drag this entire curve to the left. In gray you can still see the original, and in white the actual, the current histogram information. So the darker you make it, the more it's going to be on the left, as there's more information on the darker parts of the image, the photo, and the lighter it is, it's going to be more on the right. This is in principle just for information, this histogram menu, but how can we use that? Well, we can, for example, use it, let me reset this and close it. For example, use it under colors and use the levels adjustment, because here you will see the histogram again. Looks a little bit different, but it's the same curve, and on the left we have dark spots again, and on the right the light spots. And you can now drag this. For example, here on the right hand side, I drag it a little bit to the left. On the left hand side I drag it a little bit to the right. And what this does is it basically reduces the range. As you can see, where our white curve ends, on left and right, there's still information missing. So there are some empty spots, you could say, on the scale. And if we drag these little triangles to left and right, we're going to get rid of these empty spots. And this is going to increase the contrast, because it makes the darker parts a little bit darker and the lighter parts a little bit lighter. Let me do that here around 11 and 237. And if you compare that to the original, it's actually a huge increase in quality, I think, because now we have a much higher contrast in our result, and that is usually something that improves photos. Obviously, it's always a question of taste. Sometimes you want to have this washed out, low contrast style, but if you want to have higher contrast, this would be one way to use the histogram information via the levels. In the center, there is yet another triangle, and this for the midtones. So you can make the midtones darker or lighter by dragging this around. Whenever you get lost, click on reset. Let me adjust left and right again. And you can also see these eyedroppers to black and white. So on the left and on the right. And these can be used to sample the darkest and lightest spots in your image. Let's, for example, click on the eyedropper with the black color swatch, and now we find a black part in our photo, maybe the windows right here in the background. This should be the darkest part. I left click on it, and then this triangle will be automatically positioned right there. Value was 14 here. Let's check a white spot, maybe this one right here on the wall. And this would be 248. And here, this wall would be 233. So you can use these eyedroppers to find the darkest and lightest spots and adjust that in the photo directly. I usually like to use the sliders. As you can see the results, as long as previous checked directly applied. Try to do that yourself. You will find the specific image in the video description, or pick one of your own and then play around with the levels and try to understand how the histogram works. I think once you've understood the basic principle, it's fairly easy. There are many ways to deal with over and underexposed images in Gimp. We've got our histogram here again, and you can see that to the left there's a huge gap between our curve and the scale. So we have not enough information on this darker side, which means usually that our image is overexposed. So it's a little bit too bright. If I drag this here, you can see 23 points without any information in there. On the other side, maybe like 10 points, maybe even less without information. So it's fine on the right hand side, but it's not perfectly balanced out on the left. How can we deal with that? Let me show you 3 ways. First one is to just use the exposure option. You can find that under colors. It's a simple slider. Check the preview, and as this is overexposed, I want to go down. And this pulls the entire graph, the entire line a little bit to the left. You can even go further. Let me go to minus 0.25. We're getting in the right direction. We can also use the levels that I've already shown you in the last chapter. We'll drag this one inwards, and the one on the right, we can adjust it a little bit. Now our curve looks way better, and compared to the exposure, we've got better results as well. Let's copy the origin again, because we also have a white balance. And there is an auto option inbuilt under colors, auto white balance. Left click on it and Gimp does its thing. In this case, it has distributed the information in the photo quite well, but it has also messed with our color grading. So we now have a little bit of a bluish touch. So it has gotten way colder. Sometimes using the white balance, at least this auto function, isn't your best bet. But as it's just a one-click option, it's easy to do, and sometimes it actually gives you very good results. In this case, I would have used the levels. There we have almost a perfect histogram where it should be. Let me show you a different example, and in this case we have way more information on the left-hand side, and on the right stuff is missing. There's usually a histogram for something that's underexposed. It's not bright enough, you could say. And here again, we use the levels, the exposure, and the white balance. And you can see when we use our auto white balance, this actually gives us good results. We go to colors, auto white balance with a left click, and it hasn't messed up our color grading. It looks good. And this is what I mean. It's a simple one-click option, so why not try it out and then decide for yourself if this is what you want to use. Let's use the exposure, and here we have to go up to drag our curve to the right. And we can go up quite a lot, maybe even to 0.5. Let me try that. Or we could even go a little bit higher, but then we would lose a little bit of information in the clouds, but not a bad result. Finally, our levels. We keep the left unaffected and drag the right inwards. In this case, I would have actually used the white balance. As I've mentioned, sometimes it gives you very good results. Pick an image. You can also pick the two that I've used here. I'm going to link to them in the video description. And I make sure to try out these three methods. So under colors, you will find the exposure and the levels, and then under auto, the one-click option, the white balance. As there are many ways to adjust brightness, exposure, there are also many ways to adjust the contrast in Gimp. Let me just copy the origin a couple of times, and I'll show you a handful. First one is to simply use the contrast option. It's called brightness and contrast under colors. Make sure the preview is checked, and then you can adjust the contrast. I've got the histogram active, so you can see that here on the top right. If I increase the contrast, it's going to stretch this curve to left and right, so the dark parts get darker, light parts lighter. Problem is that it also pushes the curve down a little bit. And this is usually a sign for it getting darker. Well, let me position this right here. So this is the original curve. And now you can see how much was added to the right and left of it. This is how contrast is created. Or you could also say intensified. But at some point you're going to drag this curve too far down. And this is where the brightness comes into play. You can lift it back up by increasing it. And it's usually what you need. So you have to balance out the contrast and the brightness. Truth be told, this is only possible up to a certain point, so if I go extremely high with the contrast, this curve is totally lost, and even if I try to bring it back using brightness, it doesn't do much anymore, except for giving us a completely white canvas. But at around these values here, up to I would say 20, 30, sometimes even 40, you can still work with this simple menu. The results are clearly an improvement compared to the original. The other way to adjust the contrast and give it more contrast, I've already shown you that, is the levels. So what I did in an earlier chapter was simply to drag this to the right, and the right hand side a little bit to the left. And this already gives us a stretched curve, and it somewhat preserves the brightness. And even if we compare to the contrast adjustment, it's not much of a difference. I like to use the levels, but that's just my personal preference. There are some auto functions inbuilt, let me show you them as well. Under colors auto, we have the stretch contrast. It gives you a menu, but it's in principle only a one-click option. You can adjust your opacity and uncheck for keeping colors, but usually you want to keep them and keep the opacity to 100%. Confirm we are okay. So this would be a one-click option. There's another one inbuilt. We call that Auto 2. It takes a little bit of time to get processed. It's under Auto Stretch Contrast HSV or Hue Saturation Value. Depending on your CPU power, this might even take up to half a minute. So it's not like Gimp has crashed or anything. It just takes a little bit of time. And just like with the other auto function, it's a one-click option. So if you want to have quick results without having to think too much about what is happening here, use these auto functions. But it's a good idea, especially when you want to dive a little bit deeper into photography, to understand the histogram and use brightness and contrast as an adjustment menu, and even the levels. So for your own practice, try them out on a photo, have the histogram active to understand what is happening. And once you've done that, we are ready for the next chapter. You can sharpen images in Gimp, but the results, I would say, they're somewhat limited. For example, this photo, we cannot save this. We go to Filters, Enhance, and there is the Sharpen Unsharp Mask. And this is usually what you want to use, or what you can use in Gimp, but it's not going to significantly improve this totally lost photo. But let us go over this anyway, just to understand all of these options. First, make sure the preview is checked. Amount is basically the intensity, so 0 is no effect at all, and the higher you go, the more extreme it's going to get, and this will sharpen the edges. But what edges are being sharpened and on which ones aren't depends on the radius and the threshold. Let's, for example, check right here, the sand, the beach. If I crank this up, you can see a lot of noise or grain. When I increase the radius, this gets bigger. When I pull it down, it gets smaller. So the amount decides how much these edges are going to get sharpened, and the radius decides how big these sharpened edges will be. You could see this as pixels, and the higher you go, the bigger they're going to get, and at some point you're going to get this grain, this noise effect. The threshold, it decides which of these edges are important, you could say. If you pull it down, it's going to detect all the edges. And if you pull it up, it's going to detect none. So the higher you go, the less of these edges will be sharpened. And the lower you go, the more will be sharpened. Let us use it on a photo where we can actually improve the results. I copied this one. We could re-show the Sharpen filter here. Or we use it again under Enhance. Again, preview is checked. And you can see the effect with the default settings. The set radius is for the size. amount for the intensity. Here at around 1.8 it would be already too much, at least when you want to have realistic results. Threshold, as I've said, it defines what edges are going to be adjusted. If I go to 1.0 the max, nothing will be adjusted. At 0 everything. These would be kind of good values for our example here, 1.6, 0.3, 0.1, and especially here in the background leaves, you can see how much that sharpens these edges, and it still looks natural. And as we show that, and I give you a couple of good values to work with, or at least values that I like to use, and then I play a little bit around with it, but usually these values should be fine. Let me open a simple editor. So we have radius, amount, thresholds. As I said, the radius is for the size of these areas, and a good value is for most realistic results between 1 and 3. This is what I would advise you to use. So let me just call that is usable. The amount, once again, is for the intensity, and a good value is below 1. So everything above 1 makes it look a little bit unrealistic and more like drawing or oil painting or something. So I would advise it to go from 0 to 1, and 0 is no effect at all, so you want to be above that. But 1 should be your max. And the threshold, usually 0.5 is the upper limit, I would say, so try to stay below that. These values are just from my experience, and there are some effects where you can play with these more extreme results, but yet again, for realistic sharpening of photos, these are the values that I would advise you to use. But once more, if you've got an extreme result, like the first photo that we had, not even these values will save it. So if I copy this again, I will show this sharpen filter and I try to use values that I've just given you. For example, radius 2.3. I'll increase the amount maybe to 0.7 and the threshold 0.2. There is not much effect, especially when it comes to the model. We've certainly improved the beach a little bit and the waves, but some photos, they simply can't be saved inside of Gimp. You have to search for different solutions then, or just bite the bullet and say this photo is lost, we can't use it. This chapter is more like a presentation, but I would still urge you to try out these different menus. I'm going to tell you what I like to use in my daily practice when I use Gimp for photo editing, because some of the menus, they do the same stuff as other ones, so there's a huge overlap. But that's obviously just my, let's say, workflow or my preference. Just try it all out yourself, and then over time you'll find your own. First up, we can easily desaturate images. Under colors, there is a saturation option, but there are also one-click options right here under desaturate. In the hue saturation, for example, you can go down, and below that there's a saturation option where you only have that menu, that one slider. As I've said, under desaturate there are one-click options. For example, this one, it has a couple of modes inbuilt. You can cycle through them and then see the effect applied in real time as long as previous checked. In principle, you can also blend it using the opacity slider, but if you want to have it fully desaturated, it should be at 100% at all times. The other ones here, some of them also work quite well, but they're a little bit more complex. Color to gray, I don't use it because as you can see, it's relatively slow. Takes a lot of processing time. The mono mixer, this might be something that you're somewhat familiar with if you're used to using Photoshop. Looks a little bit different on Photoshop. In principle, RGB channels are simply split up, and then you can adjust highlights and shadows here for the specific channel. If you're just looking for a quick desaturate option, I would advise you to use this one and then confirm. You're good to go. If you want to have more freedom, as I've said, use the mono mixer. These are the two ones that I always use. Let me copy this one again, and you can easily invert colors. Let me open the histogram. One-click options here: invert, linear invert, value invert. They do it on a different math principle each time, but the process is always the same. If I here, for example, switch to the red channel, you can see that our histogram was inverted. Same goes for the other ones, green and blue. That's the original, and here it's inverted. So this is all that these color inversion tools do. As I said, they do it in a different math principle. So if we copy this again, and we go over, for example, the linear invert, it looks different than the color invert. Press Ctrl Z, and I use the value invert. Once again, different result. For example, here the value invert would just flip the entire histogram for the value channel, not the split up RGB channel. As it's a one-click option, I would simply advise you to try them out and then pick what you like best. Now let us go over the first more complex menu here, the color balance. Here we have shadows, midtones and highlights again. So here again in the histogram, shadows on the left, midtones in the middle, highlights on the right. And then you can adjust cyan, magenta, yellow. For each of these, in our example, the background has a lot of highlights. So if I switch to highlights, I can adjust primarily the background color. And if I switch to midtones and a little bit of shadows, I would primarily adjust the leaves. Not a bad menu for quicker adjustments. Another one that goes in somewhat the same direction is the menu for color temperature. Let me rename this as well. This is even more simplistic, and it's going to give you somewhat good results all the time as it adjusts all the colors at once. So when you don't go to extremes, you're going to have a good result. Downside is that you're not going to be able to adjust every aspect of this image specifically. I'm going to show you a better option later on, but first let's check the hue chroma. This is, for my taste, more something that you can use for extremer photo effects. If you want to have a chroma effect, for example, this is the menu to choose. But if you want to adjust your regular photos, for example, wedding photography, something like this, your family photos, then this is not really the menu that you need or that you should play with, and it gives you, as I've said, more extreme results. The next one is hue saturation, and this is the one that I would choose if you want to adjust specific colors. So this gives you, I would say, the most freedom. For example, pick the greenish one here, and you can see we only select the greenish leaves, and then we can adjust the hue specifically for that color. You can also add some saturation and lightness or subtract it for specifics. So hue saturation is the menu that I like to use, especially when I want to adjust the photos a little bit more specifically. Instead of color balance and color temperature, that's my choice. The master channel here in center, it's for the entire photo. So you can adjust the entire photo here as you could under color balance here with the master channel. We've already talked about saturation, exposure in an earlier chapter. Shadows and highlights is something new, but brightness, contrast and levels, we've talked about that in earlier chapters as well. But let's go over shadows and highlights. To be honest, I can't actually recall having used that in the past. But in principle, here again, you have shadows and highlights split up and you can adjust them individually. And then you can also adjust the white point. Instead of using that, I like to use the levels or directly brightness, contrast and exposure. That does the job. So you don't really need this shadow and highlights menu. And once again, it's totally up to you. This is just my preference. So go over all of this. As a project, desaturate an image, use these one-click options and the saturation menu. Invert one image, try all of these 3 one-click options. Check the color balance and the color temperature. Once again, I like to use hue saturation instead. So compare these two with the hue and saturation and then pick what you like best. Hue and chroma was for this extremer effect. And then check out shadows and highlights. This is also a menu that I don't really use, but maybe you're going to like it way more than me. Let me show the basics of using the curves adjustment. I've got a good photo here. Could have a little bit more contrast. So one of the earlier methods that we've used is the levels adjustment. I would, for example, improve this photo a little bit, at least from the perspective of contrast. Just with the color methods that I've shown you earlier, you can take photos from multiple angles in Gimp. Same goes for this contrast adjustment. We can, for example, use the curves instead of the levels. And you can understand this the same way as our histogram. So it gives us the same curve, the same channels, RGB and the value channel, which is basically the main channel. Here in this case, we have at the x-axis, once again, on the left the shadows, midtones, then in middle, on the right the highlights, just like with the histogram, but there's also a y-axis. And you can read this as input and output. So by default, 0.00 for x and y-axis, black elements for input, get the black output. And on the extreme top right, we have the highlights as an input and therefore the highlights as an output. And you can now adjust this and make, for example, a shadow input way brighter or make the highlight input way darker. And by left clicking on the curve, you can add more points to it. And this is the principle behind this curves adjustment. So if I drag this, for example, to the right, it gets darker. As all of these lighter parts on the x-axis, we are almost at the midtones here, they get darker on the y-axis and therefore the entire photo gets darker. And if I drag, for example, the far left point up, we would have all of the shadows, all of the dark spots getting lighter. and in the end this would give us a blank white canvas. Same can be done from the other direction, so I drag this to the left, which makes it lighter. I drag it down, which makes it darker. Good news is, as long as you've got the preview checked, you can see the adjustments in real time, so it's very intuitive. You can left click drag and then see what's happening and adjust it. One of the usual methods that's used in photo editing is giving this an S-curve. I've picked a bad example for this, as it makes our image way too dark, but usually this gives your images, your photos more contrast, just like with our levels adjustment earlier. You can see when you go too extreme, doesn't matter what photo you use, you're going to have too dark or too bright results. Let us go to the levels first. We'll drag this inwards to have a somewhat better histogram, and now we go back to curve, and I'll add a simple S shape here, not too much, but maybe something like this. So as always, you can combine these different methods, in this case using the levels first and then adding the curves adjustment. Maybe that's still too dark, but you get the idea. Let us delete it and start fresh. Same principle that I've shown you for white and black can be used for the color channels RGB, red, green and blue. Just pick one of these, and here for example you would make the midtones and highlights more reddish, and if you go into the opposite direction it would get less reddish, and therefore blue and green would dominate. So you can target these individual channels and adjust the curve for each. Go with blue, you can see green and red, they become more prominent, and if I drag it upwards we have more blue. So this could also be seen as a color temperature adjustment, so this is also possible via using curves. What you use in the end is up to you, what comes more natural to you, and this develops over time. So if you do it long enough you will find that maybe the curves is your thing, or maybe using the other options here is better for you. Don't worry too much about these adjustments right here, they're for the view, and a beginner doesn't really need that. You can for example make this a logarithmic view, or you can even use a freehand curve type, which allows it to create very weird results. Stick to the default, so click on reset, and then try to create this S-curve. Another tip that I want to give you is you can use the endpoint here and drag it a little bit up. This is going to give you this washed out effect. You can see that on a lot of YouTube thumbnails, especially when there's a darker, grittier theme involved in the general channel design. So this is another simple trick, S-curve, and then dragging this endpoint on the left a little bit upwards. You don't want to go too high obviously, as it would take away way too many information, but if you want that washed out look, going maybe up to here would be a good idea. Try that out yourself. Play around with these different channels RGB to understand how the color temperature is adjusted. Create a washed out effect, use the S-curve, and then you have understood the basics of this curves adjustment. Let's talk about the threshold. In principle, this is more like a setup effect that you use to set up other effects. Use cases for itself are very limited. You can see it creates a black and white idealization of your photo. And if you now think about creating silhouettes with it, you have to be very, very lucky that the colors are distributed in your photo in a way that gives you a good silhouette. So it is not really the tool to use for silhouettes. But as I've said, it's primarily used to set up other effects, and I've got a couple of those in my Gimp playlist, so check out my channel if you're interested. Let's go over the principle of this somewhat minimalistic menu. We have yet again on the left the darker parts, the shadows, on the right the highlights, midtones in between, and then we have two sliders. And what this does is it simply takes the values and makes them black and white. So if I drag this slider to left, more and more of these parts in the photo are getting white. And if I drag this other one from right to left, more of the parts are getting darkened. To set up a simple effect, let us maybe go up to here so that we've got the outline somewhat covered. I'll confirm we are okay, and you can see it's a copy, so I've got the original below. And now I can blend this threshold layer with the original using, for example, overlay or soft light. And this would be one example for a simple effect using this threshold. Try it out yourself to understand the menu. And as I've said, if you're interested in specific effects using this, check out my Gimp playlist. You can create your own photo filters in Gimp. I'm going to show you a couple. First up, we'll start very simple with a monochrome filter. And you can make that any color that you want. Let me copy the original. And for us to do that, we'll use the colorize option right here. Click on it and you can directly see this gives us this typical monochrome look. You can pick a color right here via hue, saturation and lightness and adjust it. Or use a color swatch and do it there. You can also use the eyedropper tool, but the eyedropper tool is not the best tool for this menu, because when you use it, you can only sample a color from this image. So if I turn the preview off and I try to sample a color, it doesn't really work. And if I sample one here, I'm very limited to the color range. So the eyedropper tool in this case is not the best tool. I would advise you to use the color swatch. It's the easiest one, I think. And then play around with the opacity. Once you've got a certain style that you like and you want to use that, for example, in all of your Instagram photos, in all of your YouTube thumbnails, whatever, you can save these presets. So whatever is adjusted in this menu will then be stored in this preset. To do that, you just have to click on the plus sign right here. And then you can save the current settings. Give it a name so that you can easily find it. Let me call that tutorial preset 1. I confirm we are okay. And now if you click on the icon right next to the plus sign, we can manage this under manage saved presets. We scroll down and there it is, tutorial preset 1. So this exists now, and here you could select it, click on the X to delete it if you want to. Let me store maybe a greenish one, something like this. Click on the plus sign, I make that green, confirm we are okay. I close this, and if I wanted to apply it, I can now go to colors, colorize, and then click right here to manage it, or directly on a drop down. And there you should find it now. Select it, and the menu will be adjusted. Definitely a helpful tool to have. I would advise you to create your own filter now. So use this colorize option, create a preset via the plus sign, call it whatever you want, as long as you can find it, and then try to reapply it to a different photo. Our next photo filter is a Sepia filter. Let me show you a simple way to do it. It's an inbuilt function. You can find it under colors, desaturate. And there it is, Sepia. Check the preview and you can see the effect applied in real time. It's only an effect strength adjustment, and you can blend it via the opacity with the original, which is somewhat of the same. If you uncheck this box, you're going to get a black and white example. This would be a simple solution. It does the job, but if you want to have more freedom to adjust it, it's better to create a manual Sepia effect. To do that, we create a new layer. Let me call that maybe color. Make sure it's transparent. It's on top of the photo. And now I pick a color. You don't have to be perfect in this step. Just pick something that's somewhat where you want to go. So a brownish, yellowish mix. Maybe you can pick this hex code right here. 828A65. It's a light brownish color. We'll use that for the start. Confirm we are okay. I'm on the color layer, which is empty. I go to edit, fill with foreground color. And now change the blending mode to HSL color. Afterwards, you can go to colors, colorize, and use our monochrome menu right here. Select the last color here, which was our light brown. And then you can drag this around manually and see the effect in real time. So if you want to have more like an orange feel, you can adjust that here. Just confirm we are okay. You can still adjust the opacity afterwards in this menu. Here again, confirm we are okay, and you can still bring the original back a little bit using the opacity now for this layer. So try out both, try this inbuilt under colors, desaturate, and then this manual Sepia effect. As I've said, first one is an easy solution, the second one gives you more freedom. You can create infinite amounts of filters by using textures. For example, here from Unsplash, I just search for texture, grunge, dirt, stuff like this. You'll find hundreds of free ones here. You can also use a Google search and then use the typical texture keywords. Let me show you how you can apply them. I'll copy the original and then I drag and drop the texture here. In our case it has a good size, but you may have to scale it up or down. Use the scale tool, Shift S for that. Or left click on the canvas once it's active. You may also have to rotate it. Sometimes it makes sense to turn it from horizontal to vertical and vice versa. In my case, I just keep it like this. And then let us go to colors, desaturate, and we desaturate it. In this case, it's black and white anyway, but if you use a color texture, it's a good idea to desaturate it. Once that is done, let me rename this to texture. Now we go to blending modes and use overlay or soft light. This is usually what you need, but you can also try out screen, for example, and multiply. Depending on what is more prominent in the texture, the white colors or the black colors. In my case, soft light is the best one, and then I go down with the opacity. You can also see that it makes the original a little bit darker. To fix that, we'll just have to adjust it with brightness. To do that, we go to texture and then we merge it with this function. This merges the copy with texture, let me call it with texture, and below we have the original. I'm on the texture, the with texture layer, and now I go to colors, for example, brightness, contrast. And you can adjust that. I go up with the brightness. And I don't want to go too high with the contrast, but a little bit up. And I confirm. And you can see how this brings back the original brightness. So depending on the texture that you use and the blending mode that you use, you have to adjust that a little bit. But this is always the process when you want to use textures to create photo filters. As always, I would advise you to try that out yourself. Search for a texture, for example via Google Images or on Unsplash, import it, try to apply it. As I've said, use the desaturate if it's colored. Try one of these blending modes and then try to recover the brightness. You can use the layer options to adjust your photo filters. Let me show you an HDR photo filter. I copy the original 2 times, then I desaturate this one. Top one is invisible. I use lightness HSL. That's a good one. I confirm. And then I go to filters, blur, Gaussian blur. Usually you want to stay below a value of 10 for X and Y for this high dynamic range. We confirm and then we change the blending mode to overlay. You can also see it darkens our photo quite a lot, so we want to recover that a little bit and brightness contrast. I'll increase the brightness and go down a little bit with the contrast, and you can also use the histogram and check where in the original most information was, and then reposition it for the desaturated copy. So I want this curve to be a little bit more to the left. So I decrease the brightness slightly, increase the contrast a little bit more, but that should be fine. And finally our top layer, which is the original copy, I make it visible again and set the blending mode to overlay it again. I have to work with brightness and contrast once more. And this would be a high dynamic range photo filter. And you've already seen we can use the blending modes to create these photo filter effects. Or we can also use the opacity right here. So if one layer is a little bit too intense, just go down and adjust it that way. You can also intensify these results by simply copying your layers. I select, for example, that is saturated, and then I click on this option down here to copy it, and this intensifies this specific part of the effect. So these are more options to create custom photo filters and adjust ones that you already created. So always work with copies, opacity, and blending modes. For you to practice, I would advise you to create your own HDR, your high dynamic range photo filter. As you've seen, I just copied it 2 times. The middle one is desaturated, and then I've used the Gaussian blur on it, and both have the same blending mode, which is overlay. There are lots of tutorials on YouTube about making photo filters, but most of them are done using Lightroom or Adobe Photoshop. I've got a couple of Adobe Photoshop photo filter tutorials on my channel as well, but you can almost use any of these and recreate them in Gimp. Sometimes the menus even have the same names, sometimes you have to be a little bit more creative. But let's check, for example, this one, a Lomo filter of mine. One of my earliest videos, nobody watched it. But that doesn't make it bad. Let us try to recreate this in Gimp. First up, I've used brightness and contrast in Photoshop. And we have that inbuilt. It's even called the same, brightness and contrast. Here we are. I went down a little bit with brightness and I believe up to 27 for contrast. Let's check my tutorial again. Then I've used the curves adjustment layer. We don't have adjustment layers in Gimp, but we have the curves adjustment option. First up, I've used the main channel. In Gimp it's called value channel. I've lifted the shadows and decreased the highlights a bit. Let's get back to the tutorial. And now I went over the RGB channels. For red, I've given it the typical S shape. So we'll do that right here as well. Let's go back to the tutorial. The green channel. Again, an S curve. We'll recreate that here. And finally an adjustment for the blue channel. And here it's going to look like the main channel. So in the case of Gimp, we need the same adjustment here that we added to our value channel. Now we'll confirm, and we're not that far away. And now Camera Raw is used. That is not inbuilt in Gimp, but I primarily use that to add a clarify option. And we can simulate that a little bit using Sharpen. So we'll go into this region right here. It looks very unnatural, but there is part of this Lomo filter. And you can see we are getting close. So it's not 100% there, but we could use that. Let me show you another example on my channel, which is the slumber filter. And here I've just added a curve adjustment to the red channel. Let's copy our origin again. We need the curves, the red channel. And again, we were able to somewhat recreate that. Final example is a red photo filter that I've created. And here I've used the photo filter adjustment layer. We don't have that in Gimp, but we can easily recreate that. All that it takes is a new layer. You know what, let me keep that to name color. It's transparent, it's on top of my photocopy. Now I need a red color, edit, fill with foreground color. And now I switch the blending mode to multiply. And that should be already it. You can try out the different blending modes here. But in this case, multiply is the one to go with. And if you want to adjust the color, you can either work with the opacity right here, or you can use the colorize option that I've shown you in an earlier chapter. We'll just go to colors, colorize. I'll switch to a reddish color. And you can lighten that or darken that, depending on what you want. I confirm, and as you can see, we're getting close here as well. And this is how you can work with these Photoshop tutorials. So if you can't find a specific tutorial about Gimp anywhere on YouTube, just be aware that you can trick your way, and in most cases you don't even have to, because the stuff has the same name here in Gimp that it has in Photoshop. Obviously there are some limits here and there. As I've said, we don't have an inbuilt camera raw, but in 95% of the cases you will not have a problem recreating any of these photo filters in Gimp. To practice a little bit, I would advise you to type in photo filter Photoshop into YouTube and then try to recreate whatever tutorial pops up in Gimp. Obviously you can use Gimp for photo retouching as well. I don't want to make this course about it. I've actually planned an entire course I'm going to work on next. That's going to be called Gimp Photo Retouching. But I'm still going to give you an introduction here in this photographer course, because it's a huge part of being a photographer to edit your photos properly, especially when you work with models. As this course is not specifically about photo retouching, we're not going to go over high-end skin retouching, stuff like this. But I'm going to give you a little bit of the basics. One of these basics is to whiten teeth. Let me show you one method. I'll simply copy the original and then I use the paths tool. And then I go over the outlines of the teeth with a simple left click. Don't worry too much about curves in this first step. I press the spacebar to move around in the image, and I hold Ctrl and use the mouse wheel to zoom in and out. When I've arrived at the starting point, I want to close this shape. To do that, we'll switch from design to edit mode. And this is done in Gimp with the paths tool. By holding Control, you can see that here on the left in the edit mode, this changes the cursor, and then I hover over the start point, left click, and the shape is now closed. In the next step, we're going to add curves here. To do that, we'll hover over these lines and then left click drag. This gives us handles, and we can adjust the angle by using them. And you can also left click drag on these nodes to reposition them. Let us go over it roughly. We just want to be sure that we don't cover too much of the gum. But this one should be good. Next step is to give it a layer mask so that we only have the teeth. To do that, we'll first have to right click on our canvas, then we pick select and from path. And this makes a selection out of the path that we've created. You can see that right here, our marching ants. Then right click on your layer and a layer mask, use selection and confirm. So we now have our teeth basically cut out. Let me go to select none. I switch to the layer, so from the layer mask to the layer. And then I go to colors, saturation, and if I desaturate that, you can see how this becomes whiter. You can even make this more yellowish. You don't want to go too far down because this looks unnatural, but something like this should be fine. Try it out yourself. You will find this specific image in the video description. And just as a side note, if you want to learn more about the paths tool, I've made a specific video about it. You will find it in my Gimp playlist. We can easily remove acne and these birthmarks, whatever you've got on skin. I would advise you to use the healing tool for that. You could also use the clone tool, but it's a little bit harsher. The healing tool, it blends with the environment. It's basically a brush. We can adjust the size here. When you hold Control and left click, you can create a reference point, for example right here, and then left click without holding Control over the area that you want to get rid of, and this paints the reference area over this acne, this reddish part. It's a good idea to readjust the reference point from time to time, and as I've said, the healing tool blends it with this area, so it looks kind of natural. And here below we have a birthmark. Let's get rid of this as well. It works the same way. So Control, create a reference point. Then I release Control, paint over it. Are we good? Let me show you the clone tool. Principle is the same. So Control, create a reference point and then paint over it. But you can see it's much harsher. It doesn't blend it. And therefore it looks a little bit more unnatural. For jobs like these, skin retouching, the healing brush, the healing tool is what you need. And as I've said, you can adjust it like a brush, make it a little bit smaller, for example for this birthmark, and you can get rid of it as well. As always, you will find this specific photo in the description below. Try it out yourself. Next up, we'll remove these red eyes. With modern day cameras, it's not usually a problem anymore, but it happens from time to time that you have that. There is an inbuilt option in Gimp under Enhance, Red Eye Removal. Be careful though, you may be able to fix the eyes, but you can see in the skin it already targets a couple of tones. So if I go to this position right here, where we almost have the entire reddish halo removed, you can see on the chin we've lost a lot of information even on the nose. Let me copy this again. The way to deal with it is to use a selection first. In this case I use the Ellipse Select. Then go to the second mode, where you add parts to current selection. Switch to the second eye, and if I create a selection here, you can see the first one is kept because of the second mode. For the Ellipse Select, and this should be fine. I like to work with layer masks, so I right click and add a layer mask. I use the selection and confirm. And what we've done by doing all this is to cut out these reddish eye parts. I switch back to the layer and then I go to Filters, Enhance, Red Eye Removal, and now I can even crank it up fully without the skin being affected. Actually nothing is affected but the eyes. You can still see the bluish part here from the camera. That's only natural when you get photographed, especially from that angle, but you can even try to get rid of that. But you have to do it manually. I'll keep my selection here, create a new copy, and then I go down with the exposure. And this would eliminate it all. You can also desaturate it a little bit, but it looks very unnatural, as you can see. So I would advise you to use this red eye removal, and when you have this bluish flashlight effect, that's only natural, and it makes the photo actually look way better than if you remove that as well. I've used the photo from Wikipedia. You will find it in the description as always if you want to practice. Let me show you a couple of easy photo effects. We'll start with a Dragan Effect. I think this is the easiest way to do it in Gimp, at least it's the easiest way that I know. We copy the original 2 times, and I desaturate one of the copies, the one on top in this case. Doesn't matter what mode you use here. Then I copy the desaturate layer, and I go to Filters, Blur, Gaussian Blur. I want to detach X from Y, so I unlink it here by clicking on this link icon. X should be around 10 to 15, that's usually a good value for photos, and Y a little bit lower, like maybe 5 to 10, but then you should be good. For this layer, change the blending mode to Grain Extract, which should give you this effect. So we have the Grain Extract, the Desaturate and the original copy. Go to the top and then merge it. So both desaturated, the grain and the regular one is now on the same layer. For this one, change the blending mode to Overlay. And this should be already it. If you want to intensify the effect, you can simply copy this layer. And if you want to get to a point in between 2 layers, you can just use the opacity for the top one and go down with the opacity to adjust it a little bit more in detail. So again, I've desaturated the layer, then I've used a Gaussian blur on a desaturated copy. I've used the Grain Extract blending mode for it, I've merged it, and then I've used the Overlay blending mode. Try to recreate it. It's quickly done, and I think it's easy to do. Next effect is even easier to do. It's a tilt shift. We don't really have a tilt shift blur inbuilt in Gimp, but we can create that using a focus blur. All that we have to do is to change the shape, and what we need is called horizontal. Blur radius is for the intensity of the blur. Depending on the image that you use, it's going to take some time to be visible. especially when you are on a slower PC, so have a little bit of patience. But usually you want to have such an aerial angle for your photo and then have a blur radius of like 10 to 20, something like this. This dashed line is for the feather and the straight line is for the areas that are fully in focus. Adjust a little bit if you have to, but the goal is to make it look like one of these miniature cities. Our next effect on the list is the Orton Effect. To create that, I'm going to have 2 copies. I keep the original as a backup because we're going to merge a couple of copies later on. At first, go to the top and change its blending mode to screen. This should lighten up your photo. I am on the top layer, the screen one, and now I merge it with the original copy below. Now I want you to copy this. Let me rename the copy. We want to add a blur effect. So we go to Filters, Blur, Gaussian Blur. Check the preview. It depends on the photo that you've got, but around 10 is a good value for most. You can go a little bit higher or lower, depending on your taste, and as I've said, the photo. Let me stick to 11 here, and then I switch the blending mode to multiply. And this is already the basic effect. You can still adjust it as always using the opacity, for example, or do the regular photo editing stuff, for example, play around with the brightness, contrast. It's totally up to you. To do that, it's a good idea to merge it again, and then brightness, contrast, for example. In this case, let me go down. I want you to do that yourself. If that was too quick, let us do it again. It's actually quite simple. We've got our original. I copy 2 times. The top one gets the blending mode screen. Then I merge this one. I copy the merged layer. Then I add a blur to the top one, a Gaussian blur. And this one gets the blending mode multiply. I merge it again, and this is how you can create this Orton effect in Gimp. There's an inbuilt function for light leaks. Let me show you this. We'll copy the original. Filters, light and shadow. It's called lighting effects. Pretty straightforward. Only disadvantage is that the preview isn't really applying it to the original on the canvas, so we can only see it right here in the preview window. A little bit small, but still, I think this is a good menu. Important here under options is the distance. We're going to apply it to a copy anyway, so we don't have to create a new image. Just use the slider, check the preview window, and you can left click drag on this bluish dot and reposition a center point of this light source. Under light, there are a couple of presets inbuilt and you can change the color. If for some reason the color doesn't change, just switch the preset, try again, and now you can see it. Under light 1 it works. You can change the type, but point is usually what you need. You can adjust the position here numerically, and the intensity is important. So for the intensity, you can make this light brighter. Let me go to 5 and it's a very extreme effect. 1 is a good point to start. On the material, you can even adjust the nature of this light effect. Bump map and environment map, I would advise you to stay away from that when you're a beginner. It's more like an intermediate to advanced thing. Let's just say we're good here. I confirm. And then medium does its job in the background. And here it is now. Looks pretty natural. So the further we stray away from the light, the darker it gets. And the light source comes from the direction that I've set it to. Let me show you for this tutorial also a colored light. So I re-showed the lighting on a new copy of the original. And this time I got too light, and let me just make that red. You can still reposition it, adjust all of these things, different presets, intensity. So it works the same way. Even for distance. When you're good, confirm. And now this would be a red light effect. Pretty easy to do. So check out this menu. As I've said, it's pretty helpful. Sometimes there's a bug here and there. You have to live with that. Gimp is a free tool, so I don't want to complain too much about it. It's a good menu. And let us create some bokeh effects. If you want to create a bokeh from scratch, you just need an image of something that has light in it. You can also try other colorful photos without light, but the results, they may vary. When there is light, it's going to work definitely. Then use the lens blur under filters. Increase the radius and the highlight factor, and then you can already see these typical blurred light circles. So as I've said, it's the lens blur that does that, but usually you have an image like this of a model somewhere. There's a little bit of bokeh in the background, but you want to add more. So you use simply a bokeh image. You can find lots of these on the internet. Do a Google image search. Resize it to have it as big as your original footage. Then change the blending mode. In this case, screen is good because we want to filter out the blacks. Only problem is that we want to have the model in front of the bokeh. To achieve this effect, we would have to cut out the model. And we are living in glorious times now where you can just use automatic so-called AI tools. Here's a free one, for example, Remove BG. Find a link to it in the description below. And you can simply drag and drop the image right here. And it's going to create a somewhat good cutout of the model. Once that is done, download it. Be aware that you have to sign up when you want to use the HD version, but it's free, even the HD one. Now I import this cutout and I have to scale it up because it's smaller. So this was our model cutout. And by the way, I hold Control and I scale it up. And this would be it. So depending on what you need here, you can create your own bokeh from a photo that has lights in it. It's easiest to do. Or you just use a bokeh texture, type in bokeh into a Google image search or Unsplash, and you should find something that does the job. And in this case, as I've said, I've used Remove BG, an automatic and absolutely free feature. Try to do it yourself so that you get some practice, and then we can dive into the next chapter. So our final bigger segment in this course, I wanted to give you a little bit of an introduction to photo manipulations. I'll try to keep it on beginner level, so nothing too crazy. And if you're interested in specific stuff, I once again would refer you to my Gimp playlist where I've worked my way through a couple. First up, one of the basics of every photo manipulation is a cutout, so we want to remove the background. You can do that in many ways. For example, you can copy the original and then use the Paths tool and create a cutout here of the photographer. But as you've already seen in our last chapter, we can now use free AI tools, free automatic tools. So yet again, I would advise you to check out Remove BG. Let me just drag and drop the photo here. For the not signed in version, we can download it directly. For HD, we would have to sign in, but it's free to sign in. So if you check that tool out, I would advise you to just create an account, use a burner email or something, and then you can download this HD stuff. For non-HD, it's a little bit blurry now because I have to scale it up quite a lot, but you can see how this gives us now a cutout of the model, and I can change the background easily on the layer beneath it. And you can even import other photos now that you want to use for backgrounds. Let's just say I want to have kind of like a forest environment. I'll put this here below our model. Let me call that BG1. And in that case, you can see it would be good to have a higher resolution. And in addition, you would have to play around with the color grading and adjust it a little bit. For example, one basic adjustment would be to use brightness and contrast here so that it fits the forest a little bit better, especially the lighting. Let's quickly do that. I'll have to go down with the brightness and a little bit up with contrast. And this would be one way to make this more realistic. But in general, this is the way that I would recommend. So use this free tool, it's easy to use, and then you can change the background of any photo like this. Try it out yourself. You can find a specific photo as always in the video description. Another often used effect is to simply have a specific size, so 920 x 1080 for example for a YouTube thumbnail, for a YouTube video, and then have a couple of images, mostly two, that blend with one another. Let me just add two images here, and they're way too big for my canvas, so I have to scale them down first. You can certainly just leave it like that, but it doesn't look like it would fit together. So it's not the perfect solution. For this blend effect, we can, for example, use a mask. Let me resize this a little bit. We have a better composition. Maybe something like this. I'm going to put this image of the guy on top in the stacking order and the cities below. And then I right click on it and add a layer mask. I'm going to use full opacity white. So black was for transparency, black conceals, white reveals. And I'm going to paint on the layer mask, the white one. Now I'm going to use a gradient. And you can click on this little swatch right here to pick a default. But first up, make sure that for and background color are white and black. You can click on these two little swatches here to make that. Then pick foreground to background. Doesn't matter which one. Should be linear by default. If it isn't, check that here for shape. And then left click drag. And now you can see how this gradually blends the first with the second image. And this gives you a much better transition between the two. Just be careful here. If I reverse that, I have the white color on the right. It just blends in the other direction and it wouldn't work. So just make sure that the colors are like this, white on the left, black on the right, and then you've got this effect. You don't necessarily have to use the gradient tool for that. Sometimes you have more complex images. The process is the same. Let me show you. I delete this layer mask. Now I make the city a little bit bigger. And now I add a layer mask again to the photo of the guy. I make it white. I use a brush and I make it black as foreground color. A bit smaller. And by the way, you can pick a default here as well when you click on these swatches. Now I have to make it a bit bigger. And then you paint over this with a black color. And now you can manually adjust what parts should be in the image, what parts shouldn't. And you can adjust this blend a little bit more in detail. So when you have more complex ones, do that. Just make sure that the hardness is very low so that you have a gradual blend. And now you can see I can even keep a little bit of the smoke. And this would be a better way to do it than the gradient tool when you have these more complex photos. But in general, the gradient is usually what people use when they create their YouTube thumbnails. As always, try it out yourself, use a gradient, use the brush, and try to set that up. Can you use mockups in Gimp? Short answer is no. So it doesn't work like Photoshop, where you can simply add a photo and it's going to be adjusted automatically into the right perspective. I don't know if a plugin for that exists for Gimp. If it exists, I have never used it. I don't know about it. But inbuilt in the regular version of Gimp, there is no tool that allows you to use mockups. We can only do it manually. And when it comes to doing it manually, let me, for example, import an image here. We would want to place that on the smartphone. When it comes to doing it manually, there are a couple of ways. It all comes down to what you need and what you want. When you're lucky, you can use a unified transform tool or a 3D transform tool to put this into perspective. But in many ways, this is going to skew with the perspective. It's going to mess it a little bit up. You simply adjust these corner points until they fit the perspective. But in this case, you can already see the unified transform. It completely skews with our original photo. So that's not really usable anymore. What you can definitely use for any photo is a simple masking effect. You have to scale, rotate, and reposition it first. We do that here. And once that is done, we'll add a layer mask, fully white. And then we can, for example, use Paths tool first to create a selection for the area that we need. First step, like we did before, you go over it roughly. Second step, you create the curves. Then you right click, you select from path. As we want to keep this area, we'll have to invert it under select. And now we use the brush and paint over it in black. Just make sure you are on the layer mask, and in this case we can use a hardness of 100%. Once that is done, we have a little bit of details to fix. So depending on the zoom level, you can see right here we aren't perfect. So let me paint over this. Here in this case, I have to use a white color to bring back this black part. And I always press X to cycle between black and white. And then I paint over the layer mask. Can be a little bit tedious, but as I've said, there is no inbuilt function for mockups to my knowledge. If you want to try it out, just pick the same photos here that I've been using. It gives you a little bit more practice on using these layer masks. Let's create photo collages. At first I've created a canvas here, YouTube size 1920 x 1080. And then I need some guides. I use new guide by percent, 50%. Will give us the center. I'll make that 2 times for vertical and horizontal. And by the way, try to follow me as we go. It's going to be a little bit of a longer chapter. So pause the video here and there and recreate it step by step. Now I import my images. I've got 5. Let me rename them. And now let me check which is which. I make them invisible. I want to keep that one for last. So number 1 is going to be our last image. Start with number 2. I use the scale tool and I have to be on that layer and then resize it. I want this to be at the top left. You don't have to worry here much about anything for the first one, as it's in the lowest position, so the other photos are going to overlap it. Here's our second photo, number 3. And you can reposition that, so that would fix the edges. But if you want to adjust the composition, you have to get rid of overlaps. To do that, we'll use a layer mask. Easiest way to use it is, for example, use the marquee, rectangle tool, so the rectangle select, drag a selection here, and then we can use the selection. But we want to invert it first so that we have everything selected but this area. So we go to select, invert, and now we can right click on layer 3, add layer mask, use selection and confirm, and this gets rid of our overlap. Select none, and we can continue with the next image. Yet again, scale it, reposition it. You may want to adjust the composition a little bit. We don't have to worry about the bottom overlap, as we have one more photo to go. Or we'll have to take care of the left hand side. So yet again, rectangle select tool, select this area, go to select, invert, right click on layer 4, add layer mask, use selection and confirm via add. Final image on the bottom right will be number 5. And we're going to use the layer mask once more. So select the area that needs to get deleted. I invert the selection, use the layer mask, and we're good here. Now let's check image number 1. As I've said, I wanted this to be our last one. It should be on top. So I'm going to reposition that in the stacking order to here. Now I resize it. It's a good idea to create a new layer. Let me call it circle, it's transparent. And now I use the ellipse select tool. You can left click drag and eyeball it, but it's a better idea. Let me press Shift Ctrl A to deselect. It's a better idea to check this expand from center and then go to center, hold Shift, and now you know that your circle is perfectly in center, so we can work with that. Let me just give this a color. I'm on my empty circle layer. I use the bucket fill tool and make it white. And we can work with this now. What we want to do is place our image 1 on top of the circle. So make image 1 a little bit transparent. I resize it and reposition it. And this would be a good position, I would say. Then right click on the circle layer, use alpha to selection. Switch to layer 1 and use this as a layer mask now. It's going to give us a nice cutout. I can readjust the opacity. That looks fine. Then again, alpha to selection on the circle layer, because now we want to create frames. I create a new layer for that. Let me call it frames. It's transparent. I've got my circle edges selected and I can go to Edit, Stroke Selection. It uses the foreground color white in this case. And I have it set to 6 pixels. I confirm. Shift Ctrl A to deselect. Now Ctrl A to select everything. Again, Edit, Stroke Selection. When you use 6 pixels, it's going to get cut in half as it's positioned in the center. So you actually want to double that to 12 to have the same thickness as we had for the circle. So press Ctrl Z, Edit, Stroke Selection. And I make this 12. Now it fits. Shift Ctrl A. We can also add frames here for the center positions, horizontal or vertical. I use Direct Angle Select for that. Just drag it from left to right. We know that our thickness should be 12. You can also cut that in half if you want to and just use 6. It depends on what you want, but I'll go with 12 here. And then we want to adjust the position so that it's in center. To do that, we can use basic math. If you've forgotten what your canvas size is, just go to File, New, and it was the last saved value. In my case, this was 1080. So we need to cut that in half and go to 540. And once that is done, we can use the bucket fill tool and then left click on these areas, but be careful, don't click on the area where it overlaps with the circle because we don't want to have a frame there. We only want to have it on the side. The sides are good. Shift Ctrl A. Finally, we need this one right here, a vertical. Again, just drag it like this, make it 12 or 6 pixels depending on what you want. Position right here. We have to check again. We've used 1920, and if we cut that in half, we have 960. But you can see it uses the start point and not the center. So we have to factor in the 12, cut that in half, which is 6, and then go down to 954. And this should put it in center. So if you only use 6 as a value instead of 12, go to 957. And again, use the bucket fill tool, left click on it, only outside of the circle, and then you're good. In the end, just go to Image, Guides, remove our guides, and then you've got your photo collage created. There are inbuilt filter effects. Some of them are one-click options, some have a little bit of a complex menu, but all of them are very intuitive. So if you, for example, use here an artistic glass tile, and if you adjust it in the menu, you can see the effect applied in real time. There are also render effects, for example, for pattern or noise. The distorts are usually interesting effects. Here, for example, a rearrange. I don't want to go over all of these in this course, but you can check my playlist yet again because I've made basically about all of these or almost all of these a video. So if you're interested in a specific one, check out my Gimp playlist. Just as an example in this chapter, I want to go over the Kaleidoscope effect because I think it creates very, very interesting abstract results. Just check the preview, and then even though the menu is a little bit intimidating, it's quite easy to use due to the intuitive and real-time adjustments. For example, we can adjust the mirror right here, and you can see the original just gets mirrored. And if you add more mirrors, it's going to get double, tripled, quadrupled in a specific angle. For the zoom, you can go out, and all of a sudden you have this very abstract result. You can adjust center, offset, trimming in X and Y axis. And on top, you could also adjust the rotation of the mirror and the result. Whenever you get lost, basically all of these effects have a reset function. We can return to the original settings. And as I've mentioned a couple of times in my tutorials, I always like to work on copies so that in case something goes wrong, we still have the original as a backup. Especially when you work with filters, that's a good idea to use that. You can also combine a couple of these filters. So if I add, for example, a waves effect here, that could be added to the Kaleidoscope. And by combining filters, you can create, in principle, infinite amounts of effects. Try it out yourself, and as I've said, if you're interested, check out my Gimp playlist for more videos about these filters. As our final project, I'm going to show you how to create a double exposure effect. This can be quite complex, but it can also be super easy. The magic behind it is it's basically created by the selection of the photos that you use. I've got a sunset right here, and then a simple model photo, and I'm going to use the typical YouTube thumbnail size again, or the YouTube video size. And then I'm going to show the easy approach to this. First up, you want to cut out the model. Already shown you a couple of times, we can use remove BG for that. Drag and drop it here, download the results. Import it to Gimp. And I have to scale it a little bit. We will start with this one. Next up, we go to colors and use a threshold. It's going to turn it into idealized black and white. Just reposition these sliders so that you can see the face properly, but not too much. Something like this should be good. I confirm. Now put the sunset image on top of this cutout and switch the blending mode to screen. And this ensures that the sunset is only visible in the black parts of the cutout. You can now scale the sunset, reposition it. And if this was a YouTube thumbnail, I would add maybe some text here. Just be careful that you don't put the text, when you use it in black at least, that you don't put it where the sunset is visible, or it's going to get a double exposure as well. And when you want to resize and reposition the cutout here, you also have to reposition and resize the sunset and maybe even the text. That is something to keep in mind. Get your composition right before you set everything up. That's easiest. So for example here, if it was a real project for me, I would make the body way smaller and the head way bigger for the model. I reposition that maybe a little bit upwards, up to here. You can see I have to reposition and even rescale the sunset. And now I have to reposition the text because there's an overlap. You can get around it if you have your composition in mind beforehand. But it's a general process. All you need is a cutout, then use a threshold, and then add via a screen blending mode the overlay. And that's all that I wanted to show you in this Gimp photographer course. Obviously we haven't covered all of the options inbuilt in Gimp. I once again refer you to my Gimp playlist. If you're a total beginner, I've got a beginner course on that. If you want to learn more about selections, I've got a selection course. If you want to learn about specific functions and filters, I've made specific videos about that. And next up, I'm trying to work on a Gimp retouching course. So if you watch this video in the future, you may find this already in my Gimp playlist as well. If there are still questions open, if there's something that I haven't covered anywhere in my playlist, let me know in the comments, and if I know the answer, I'll make a video about it. And in general, I'm actually quite happy when you tell me what you want to see on my channel. So if there's a Gimp course that you want me to create, or even Inkscape, other programs, let me know. I'm open to ideas, and if I find the time I'm going to work on that. I hope this course was helpful, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.